As soon as you get into the workforce, they're going to give you a BlackBerry, and you're just going to be texting people updates that are horrible when it comes to grammar. So why is that important?
Hi, and welcome to MBA Pod TV. I'm your host, Bob O'Keefe. Scoring well in the verbal section of the GMAC gives you a competitive edge when applying to business schools. It's just as important as your quantitative score. So if you end up with a high score on the quant side, but low on the verbal section, which happens quite often, that low verbal score will be seen as a weakness on your application. So what can you do with a low verbal score? To find out, I'll be sitting down with Brian Galvin, Director of Academic Programs at Veritas Prep, a GMAT prep and admissions consulting company. Brian scored in the 99th percentile on the GMAT. We'll discuss strategies on improving a low verbal score, whether those with a quantitative background will be given leniency on the verbal section, and we'll run through a sentence correction problem. You'll also hear what admissions directors have to say about your GMAT score. So if this is the first time that, let's say I'm a candidate, I've taken the GMAT, and I'm not happy with my verbal score, what are some ways that I can maybe improve upon? What are some traps people fall into, and how can they fix them?
Probably the biggest misconception with the verbal section is that every question is somewhat subjective. It's, well, D's good, but C's also good. Maybe D's a little bit better. One thing that people who've done well on the math section, but are still worried about the verbal section, can really focus on and see their score improve pretty well is that the verbal section is as mechanical as the math section. So the first thing is realize there's one right answer, 4 wrong answers. And the other thing that goes into it is every question is about something. It's about botany, it's about chemistry, it's about poetry. You're not applying to a literature program or a botany program or a biology program. You're applying to business school. So focus on the words you know to be important. Words like however, which mean that an argument's changing direction, or therefore, which means this is the conclusion of the argument. On sentence correction, words like pronouns or verbs that you know to be important in some of these. Be proactive with looking for those words. And if a word comes up like chlorophyll or something like that, you're not a scientist. You don't need to be able to understand that. So focus on the words you know, not those that you don't. If you're proactive and you see it as a mechanical test on the verbal side as opposed to something subjective, I think that's where you're going to see your greatest score gains.
Excelling in the verbal section of the GMAT is a great way to differentiate yourself from the crowd, particularly if you're an international applicant or come from a quant-focused career. But acing the verbal section isn't exactly the easiest thing to do. We'll run through a sentence correction problem in a moment, but first, let's see what these admissions directors have to say about your GMAT score.
All the standardized tests do is give you an indicator of how someone will do academically, and it's just one of many indicators. You know, you have their whole undergraduate transcript, you've got their whole career performance, some people have graduate degrees, so there's a lot of evidence, and we're just looking to make sure by the standardized test that the person will be ready for the classroom, the rigors of the classroom.
It's one of the pieces we look at. We also look at your undergraduate and graduate academic work if you have that, have a graduate degree, and put a lot of weight on your work experience as well. So they're all weighed independently for each individual applicant. But the GMAT certainly is an important feature of your application, and actually the only piece that you can quickly change. If you don't do as well, for example, when you take it once, you can take it again. You can't change your work experience in a rapid way. You can't change your undergraduate GPA. You're no longer an undergraduate. Your GMAT is the one piece of your application that you do have some control over in a short period of time.
Admissions officers really only care about your top score with very few outlier examples. I always tell my students, I think you're more likely to have an admissions officer look carefully at your scores if you had a 750 and then a 760 instead of if you had a 600 then a 760. You know, that 600 to 760, you learn you had some weaknesses and you put some emphasis in studying those and improve, whereas 750 to 760, but if they look and there's no community service in your background or you haven't been promoted at work, it's, well, why did you spend that extra time to squeeze out 10 more or less irrelevant points?
Of the 3 types of verbal questions you'll find on the GMAT, reading comprehension, critical reasoning, and sentence correction, you can improve on sentence correction a bit more quickly than the others if you understand the rules of grammar. So let's check out this sentence correction problem and see if you can pick up a few tips.
And I think this is where a lot of students have the most trouble seeing it as even relevant to the test, grammar, sentence correction. I know myself when I started to see these on there, it just seemed a little bit awkward. Why in the world would Harvard Business School or Stanford JSB care as much about my ability to use grammar. As soon as you get into the workforce, they're going to give you a BlackBerry, and you're just going to be texting people updates that are horrible when it comes to grammar. So why is that important? Well, part of it is because it's less about grammar. Here we've got a question where some of the choices you're going to need to make are unlike water or besides water. It's not really, it's a kind of a preference type thing. I think a lot of people can get lost in the details. Oh, geez, when was the last time I saw that written? Do I like unlike? Do I like besides? We have also which is complimentary or which is offered free of charge. Geez, they kind of mean the same thing. Is one really grammatically preferable to the other? What this one comes down to is the fact that this introduction here is modifying all passengers will. So unlike water, all passengers. Water can never be like or unlike passengers. They're two different things. Passengers are a type of people. Water is a molecular, not element. Not a scientist. You don't need to know science. So in this case, it's a modifier that can't modify all passengers. So unlike water or besides water are both wrong. Here, unless the drink is water, is an independent clause. It's got its own verb, its own part of a sentence. So that's going to be correct, not necessarily because of a personal preference, but because it's mechanical. If it doesn't modify passengers, but it is a modifier, it's out. And this is, again, something that we try to teach, is being proactive and not reading the sentence and reacting to it, but starting to look. If you have an introductory description, it's a modifier. It has to modify what's next, or it has to change the equation, so to speak, and become not a modifier, but rather an independent clause or its own part of the sentence. There are several rules, probably in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 major grammar rules that they test. Can you recognize that in an unfamiliar situation and make your decisions based on your core competencies, so to speak, to use a corporate strategy term, knowing what you do well, making the decision on that versus getting lost in details, which as a business person would sink you if you're getting lost in small details and not big picture items.
Right. Okay, so now what if I'm a super techie and I've got quantitative scores through the roof? Am I going to be given a little bit of leniency on lower verbal scores by the admissions office?
Maybe not. I mean, to an extent, obviously they're going to look at the entire candidate, but you're tending to compete with other people like you. If you're coming from IT, you're sort of competing with other IT people. You're not competing with the person coming out of the Peace Corps or the writer, the literature major. So you do need to differentiate yourself from that group somehow. So to an extent, you'll get a little bit of leniency. They see those things you excel at, and may be able to understand that no one's entirely perfect. But because the verbal section of a GMAT is mechanical, that type of thought process can break these things down. That's your best chance to excel and differentiate, that you kind of get what the test is about. So if you're looking to hopefully sneak your way in, to be in that last group of do we waitlist or do we accept, you may get a little bit of leniency. If you really want to feel confident about your application, if you embrace the aspects of the verbal test that match with your strengths and really capitalize on those, that's going to take you to another level of candidacy.
There are some very quantitative schools that would look for a very high quant score, and so that would have more weight in evaluating the admissions criteria. But most schools now are looking for a very well-rounded individual, so they want strong verbal scores as well. So it's going to depend on each school and how they use it. The GMAT's not one that has a cut score, that if you reach a certain score, you're in to any school. It's just one piece of the admissions criteria.
So if a candidate's taken the GMAT, they're done, they've accepted their score, maybe they don't have the highest verbal score that they would like, are there other areas in the application where they can make up for that?
The essays in the interview, definitely. If you're able to demonstrate, communication ability, both written and verbal, and the ability to respond to questions and construct a logical argument about why you're a great business school applicant. So if you do find yourself in that situation, not all is lost. You have the essay, the analytical writing assessment portion of a GMAT that, to an extent, is not as important as the verbal section itself, but another place where you can demonstrate facility with language and everything. So you do have options there. But again, I think if you're doing well on those, there's really no reason you shouldn't be able to do well in the verbal section of a GMAT with enough preparation.
And that's it this time on MBA Pod TV. I'm your host, Bob O'Keefe. Visit us at mbapodcaster.com to register for weekly audio and video shows. Join us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest news and insight on your MBA application process.